Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're diving right into the heart of the modern information crisis. It's this idea that the classic marketplace of ideas seems to be, well, collapsing, really, into what we now call an attention economy. The old liberal assumption, that truth just wins out if you let ideas compete, that's being seriously tested by these algorithms that, frankly, seem to profit from sensationalism, division, and, conspiracy.
Right. So the central question we're grappling with is this. Does the sheer proven amount of systemic harm that comes from conspiracy content spreading so fast, does that demand that we regulate the actual platform architecture, manage that risk? Or is focusing on, say, user autonomy and softer approaches, things that aren't outright censorship, is that the only ethical way forward?
A really crucial question.
Because the fundamental business model, what some call surveillance capitalism, it inherently, almost by design, amplifies toxic stuff because that's what grabs engagement, and engagement is profit.
And I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely see the systemic problems you're highlighting, I argue that these kind of hard or sometimes opaque interventions, they risk violating core liberal principles, specifically the listener's right to decide for themselves. I think the ethical and probably more effective long-term solutions lie in empowering the user, building resilience, demanding transparency.
Okay, let's get into it then. My position, to start, is that the evidence is just overwhelming. The digital market, in this sense, has failed. The platform design, it's purely optimized for engagement, not truth, not accuracy. We know from major studies, like one in Science magazine, that false news spreads way faster, way wider than true news. Why? Because it's novel. It hits emotional triggers. And look, this isn't some accident. It feels very much like a designed outcome, where the algorithms systematically push the dangerous stuff. And since this amplification causes real, measurable harm, we see it in public health outcomes, we see it eroding democratic trust, sometimes even leading to violence, we have to shift focus. We can't possibly chase down every single piece of bad speech. It's impossible. We need to regulate the process, the systemic risk baked into the architecture itself. Something like what the EU is trying with the Digital Services Act, the DSA. That's the direction, I think.
Okay, I absolutely see why you think regulating the system itself is the only way to tackle something this, massive. The scale is huge. However, the risks of mandating really aggressive censorship, especially when it's done by these giant private tech companies acting as, unelected judges of what's legitimate knowledge, those risks are just too great for me. We have to be incredibly careful about creating what Foucault called a regime of truth, enforced by technology.
Right.
These hard interventions, they feel fundamentally paternalistic. They imply the listener just isn't capable of figuring things out. My position is that we have to prioritize building user resilience and doing it scalably. Things like pre-bunking, inoculating people against manipulation techniques, and also implementing design changes, like adding friction to slow down that impulsive emotional sharing. We need to focus on transparency, on strengthening the user's own critical thinking without just taking down content wholesale.
Okay, let's move straight to the evidence then, because I think we need to stop treating this like some abstract philosophical debate and look at the actual costly damage. The harm principle, clearly met here. The cost of doing nothing is just enormous. Research estimates that disinformation costs the global economy something like $78 billion a year. That's just financial loss, market volatility, fraud, you name it. But maybe more critically, we have such clear evidence now linking specific conspiracy theories, like all the Stop the Steal stuff around the 2020 US election, directly to real-world violence.
Yes, the link is there.
Right, so that moves us past a simple free speech argument and squarely into Karl Popper's actual paradox of tolerance. The point where groups refuse rational debate and turn to coercion or violence? Popper said tolerance has to end there. And the architectural systems that amplified those calls to violence, they just cannot be exempt from some form of regulation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the architecture is the right place to intervene. Primarily because trying to suppress ideas, especially ideas tied to someone's identity, it often just fails spectacularly. Hard interventions like takedowns or deplatforming, they usually trigger the Streisand Effect. They make the person a martyr. We saw this so clearly with David Icke. When he got kicked off the big platforms, a study showed that within a week, public mentions of him on Facebook actually shot up by 84%.
The short-term spike, yeah?
Exactly. You don't stop the problem, you just push it underground into these hidden, unmoderated spaces. Some people call them cyber ghettos like LBRI or BitChute. And what happens there? You get hidden, probably accelerated radicalization that we can't even see, let alone counter. That doesn't feel safer to me.
Okay, that's an interesting point about the Streisand effect, though I might frame the deplatforming effectiveness a bit differently. You cite David Icke, which is, one individual, and you focus on that short-term spike in mentions. But what does the evidence show when these interventions happen at scale across a whole network? There was a major study in Nature looking at the systematic deplatforming of over 70,000 accounts after January 6. What they found was that this coordinated action significantly cut down the long-term reach of misinformation. It actually dismantled parts of the network infrastructure. So, if large-scale coordinated action does work to disrupt the underlying harm network, doesn't that make your argument about migration and the Streisand effect, well, maybe less compelling in the bigger picture?
Okay, that's a compelling point about the network effect. I'll grant you that. Coordinated actions, yes, they likely are more effective than just banning single individuals. However, have you fully considered the chilling effect that comes with these aggressive, large-scale mandates? I mean, if platforms are required facing massive fines, what is it, up to 6% of global revenue under DSA? If they're required to do these annual risk assessments and aggressively mitigate vague ideas like systemic harm, doesn't that inevitably create overly broad, maybe opaque rules? Isn't there a real risk of intimidating legitimate voices? Think about investigative journalists, whistleblowers, maybe even political dissidents criticizing powerful people. They might hold back for fear of being labeled a disinformation spreader. Doesn't that kind of censorship, even if unintended, ultimately undermine the open society we're trying to protect?
I understand the concern about the chilling effect. I do. But I might frame that risk differently. The fear that strong regulation will silence vital critical voices, it might be a bit overstated here. There was a study, I think from the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology, that looked at this. They found that when users operated under broader content rules, they didn't actually change the substance of their critical messages. They changed the tone, made it maybe more polite, more civil. They still made their point. So the necessary trade-off here, and I think we have to accept some trade-offs, is probably some level of non-transparent reduction. Call it shadow banning if you like, but we know that downranking content significantly reduces its viral spread. It's proven way more effective than just sticking a fact-check label on something. And crucially, it often avoids that huge public backlash you get with a full takedown. The goal of regulating architecture isn't stopping speech, it's stopping harmful amplification.
I see why you're prioritizing that proven effectiveness of scalable actions like downranking. Reducing immediate harm is, it's a powerful argument. However, the trade-off you seem to be asking us to accept, implicitly, is the enforcement of this single centralized regime of truth, to use Foucault's term again, requiring complex process-heavy regulation like the DSA. Well, it basically turns the platform into this incredibly powerful, unelected judge of what counts as acceptable systemic risk. We might solve the immediate technical problem of misinformation spreading like wildfire, yes, but we risk creating this massive central authority that could easily stifle the kind of nonconformity and dissent that's actually vital for progress and for checking power. That trade-off for me fails to respect the listener, the user, as an autonomous thinker who can handle complexity. And I think there are alternatives. For example, the idea of design friction. This focuses on using human psychology against the machine's pull. When people share really sensational stuff, they're often running on what Kahneman called System 1 thinking, fast, intuitive, emotional. Friction design puts in tiny speed bumps, like making you wait 3 seconds before you can share, or a pop-up asking, "Did you actually read this article?" Research shows this nudges the brain into System 2, that slower, analytical mode. And that simple nudge significantly cuts down the sharing of low-quality emotional junk without censoring anything.
That's an interesting mechanism, friction, definitely part of the toolkit. But I think the biggest real-world constraint that's kind of shaping this whole debate for us right now is the global regulatory picture, specifically the Brussels effect. Honestly, the whole debate we have in the US about the First Amendment versus Section 230 immunity, it's becoming increasingly, well, almost moot on a global scale because of the EU's Digital Services Act. The DSA carries these huge global fines, up to 6% of a platform's total worldwide annual revenue, if they don't manage systemic risks properly. For the big global platforms, the Googles, the Metas, it's just operationally and financially much easier to adopt the EU's strict, risk-based standards everywhere. They just apply it globally. So, like it or not, the DSA model is being exported, forcing platforms to manage systemic risk and regulate their architecture, regardless of what Silicon Valley might prefer. The standards are being set in Brussels, and they demand architectural accountability.
I absolutely agree. The Brussels effect is a massive commercial reality. It forces compliance, no question. Though I still believe the psychological constraint is more fundamental to actually solving the problem, regardless of where the rulebook is written. Why do people fall for conspiracies? It's usually not just because they lack facts, right? It stems from deeper psychological needs, the need for certainty, for security, and maybe most importantly, the social need for belonging, for identity. Dan Kahn's work on identity protective cognition is key here. It shows people process information in ways that protect their standing within their social group, not necessarily to find objective truth.
True.
So because of that, aggressive debunking or even downranking often fails, or worse, backfires, because it feels like an attack on their identity. That's why I keep coming back to pre-bunking or inoculation theory. Behavioral research suggests it's scalable and ethically sound. It works by targeting the techniques of manipulation, spotting straw man arguments or fear-mongering tactics, instead of attacking the core belief itself. It plays on our innate desire not to be fooled, strengthening the user's own defenses against the noise without making them feel censored or attacked.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it seems this debate really boils down to trade-offs in how we handle this collapsed digital market, this attention economy. If your main priority is stopping immediate, systemic, real-world harm, the kind we see impacting public health or fueling political violence, and if you fundamentally believe these incredibly powerful platforms must be held accountable for their distribution power, then you're likely going to lean towards architecture regulation. That means the DSA model, focusing on mandatory risk audits, due process, transparency, basically governing the amplification machine itself.
Right. If, on the other hand, your priority is protecting individual autonomy, exercising intellectual charity, and, crucially, avoiding the very real danger of centralized censorship and all the unintended consequences that might bring, then you'll probably favor soft interventions, things like large-scale pre-bunking to build resilience, and using friction design, those speed bumps, to empower the user's critical thinking without actually removing content.
And my final thought is this. We have to recognize that the right to speak doesn't automatically mean a constitutional right to be algorithmically amplified to millions. Therefore, the amplification system itself, the core lever of platform power, it simply must be governed.
In mine. We have to resist the lure of the easy fix. Real, lasting societal resilience against bad ideas doesn't come from having them whisked away by some authority. It comes from us learning how to effectively argue against them and understanding the psychological reasons they take root in the first place.
This was The Debate. Stay curious, stay critical.